So we're talking about vehicle intelligence for all domains. My name's Courtney O'Neill Allen, and I'm the Director of Content for GovExec Events. And when we talk about vehicle intelligence, we're really talking about the next big step in AI. Something that's not just smart, but also embodied, responsive, and built into the systems of our forces that rely on from across the land, sea, air, cyber, and more. From autonomous convoys to drones and ground robots, this is where cutting-edge innovation meets real mission impact. And joining me here to unpack this topic is Mr. Jason Brown, General Manager of Defense for Applied Intuition. Welcome, Jason.
Yeah, thank you so much. Congrats on another great event.
Thank you. I hope everybody's enjoying it. So let's just get started. When we talk about the foundation of vehicle intelligence, what does that actually mean in terms of defense?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's just start with that term, vehicle intelligence. If you think about it, the piece of technology we, interact with, first is kind of our phones and then our laptops. The next piece of technology are vehicles that we either operate or vehicles that we direct. So it's very natural that you're going to see AI come into those vehicles. So vehicles in all domains, air vehicles, space vehicles, ground vehicles, of course. And then, when we talk about vehicle intelligence, what is that? That is AI tied to perception, planning, control, and communication embedded within the functions of those vehicles. And so I want to just really kind of talk a little bit more about, before we move on, about, I'll start with a story. Really, a vehicle intelligence isn't just about tech for tech's sake. I'm going to throw tech into this thing. You need to understand what is actually going to enhance the mission in the case of a defense context. So we had the Secretary of the Army, Driscoll, and then we had General George, the Chief of Staff of the Army, come and see our company a couple months ago. They toured our garage where we had a Porsche, a Bentley, Ford Raptor, so we do on and off-road, autonomy for those vehicles. We had a bunch of drones that we use for our aerial testing, and then we had an uncrewed surface vessel for our maritime testing that we work with the U.S. Navy on. The point we made was, autonomy is about 90% the same for all of these. When it comes to technology, the talent, the technical approaches, and then that last 10% is really addressing the use case. So they said, well, what if we sent you a Humvee and an infantry squad vehicle, an ISV, and what could you do with it? What cool stuff could you do with it in 10 days? And so we worked through some ideas, and then the secretary said, I'm going to do that. Literally 2 days later, a 3-star general calls me and says, what's your address? And then they shipped us these vehicles. We made the ISV autonomous. We made the Humvee act like a command and control node. We integrated a drone. They saw the video that we produced for them. They said, get this out to Louisiana, to JRTC with the 101st. And then we interacted with the actual users. And then once you start interacting with the users, when they see an intelligent vehicle for the first time, then they're like, well, how do we use this? How can we use it to do logistics? Can we use it as a diversion for the enemy? Can we use it, can we integrate, they said, can you pump YouTube into this thing? We're like, well, why do we want YouTube into this vehicle in the middle of this, in the field? They said, because we use YouTube to learn how to maintain everything. Every piece of kit, there's a YouTube video on how to maintain it. So we literally over Starlink, injected YouTube so they could use it. So, that's kind of, vehicle intelligence is not just tech for tech's sake. It's actually what does the user need? What does the mission need?
Right. So I think earlier, before we got on stage, we were talking about in our everyday lives what that looks like. And I brought up the fact that I drive a Volvo and it has a very good, safety mechanism in it to prevent me from getting in a car wreck. So that would be an example of vehicle intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a little too good, but
it is. Yeah, it is too good. I mean, yeah, we'll get into why it's too good here in a second, I'm sure. Yeah.
Sure thing. So when we're talking about this, building upon that, how does simulation and virtual testing shape our real world capabilities?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is driverless cars. So the Volvo. So you're operating the Volvo, so it's assisting you.
Yeah.
But driverless cars are a solved problem. So many of you have probably had the opportunity to take a Waymo in San Francisco, Phoenix, LA. It's a solved problem. It is inevitable that robots are going to be better drivers than us. There's a huge implication for defense when you consider that. Why is that the case? Why are driverless cars a solved problem? It's because of simulation and being able to test in an environment, in a virtual environment that from a physics-based perspective represents the sensors, the objects, the vehicles, the dynamics, all in a very fine-tuned way. And that simulation enables thousands of iterations of those vehicles operating in an environment in a single night, and then you expose these failure modes, and then you're able to make adjustments. Live testing is absolutely still required, but live testing is so incredibly expensive. So simulation and the creation of sim environments is really critical. So from a physics-based standpoint, and then when you consider, that the commercial automotive industry has really been leveraging the simulation now for a number of years, we've brought that over to a lot of the same technical approaches, the same technology in many cases, the same talent. Some of my teammates who work on that are here today with us. And then they basically, how do you do that in a maritime environment? How do you create sea states, glint, salt spray on the camera? How do you do that in a collaborative environment? How do you replicate the RF spectrum from a physics-based perspective so you can understand if the communications among the swarm are actually going through? And so all of this stems from a lot of work that happens in the commercial sector and now has extended to, the military sector. And then, from there, it's really about how do we implement that in the actual operational environment? How does simulation become part of the development loop that has to be continuous for all of these autonomous systems and or, some level of autonomous systems to be able to remain performant in a very hyper-dynamic environment through sophisticated, data management techniques, integrating the sim, integrating Gen AI to represent the environment in, based on, what the actual, robots are perceiving. And then how does that continuously work on that? That's what we are working on right now.
Okay, so with the simulation component, you mentioned creating those false or fake environments. How does AI play a part in the human machine learning so that the battlefield feels more intuitive?
Yeah, so autonomy is here. It is the trend toward autonomy is very clear in a number of different ways. Autonomy fundamentally is where AI meets the warfighter. And so I described this scenario with the Army and getting out in the field. That is exactly what needs to scale in a very big way to be able to get the actual concept of operations, worked out, fleshed out, bring the autonomy out into the field, and then let the warfighters work on it. The challenge, to be very frank, there's been a lot of investment, when it comes to AI in kind of the operational level, right?
Okay.
So what do I mean by that? In the operations centers, there's a lot of interest. I jokingly say that the Pentagon is liquored up on LLMs. So what do I mean? What do I mean by that? Everyone's enamored with what LLMs can do. And the folks who are saying, okay, I've been in this experience where I'm in an operations center and I am making fundamentally this resource allocation decision, which is really, really difficult. And I've been there, right? Where you have all of this information and I need to allocate these resources. Maybe they're logistics resources, ISR resources, combat resources. And I need to make that decision. I need to make it quickly with the highest quality, high quality decisions as fast as I can to enable competitive advantage and understanding risk. And the challenge, the natural inclination is, okay, I see this LLM, of course LLMs can do that. The problem is that the data that trains and feeds a lot of these capabilities just doesn't exist. The data from the resources that you have to allocate, the data from the edge, wherever the edge is, the edge could be in a supply chain, the edge could be on the battlefield. How do you get all of that into those solutions to make better decisions? The answers are the byproduct of actually enabling retrofitting or creating software-defined vehicles is the way that you start to generate the data that you need to make those solutions, viable. So the long and the short of that is a lot of investment has to go down into the tactical level, into AI and in autonomy to make the whole enterprise effective.
Awesome. So with the autonomy component, how is swarming changing how we think about force structures as well as mission planning?
Yeah. I guess, why do we talk about swarming? And swarming it's not a new concept, it's not a new topic. I mean, swarming's been around for as long as war has been around, conflict has been around. And then the reality is that the many and the small always defeat the few and the exquisite if the many and small are effectively networked. And so that effectively networked is the term you have to unpack. And so fundamentally, when you're talking about robots, how do those robots or how do those autonomous systems, whether they are fully autonomous or some level of autonomy, how are they interacting? How are they effectively networked? And that is certainly contextual. Sometimes it's continuous networking, sometimes it's periodic. But whoever figures that out, right? Whoever figures out how to fundamentally get to that effectively networked aspect of the swarm, that is where all the competitive advantage lies, right? So the Iran, and by the way, so much of this technology, most of this technology is out there, right? It's democratized, it's everywhere. The Iranians build the Shahed drone. The Shahed drones, are not effectively networked. If they were, that would be a very, very different capability that you would have to deal with. If the swarm could fundamentally deal with attrition, if it could deal with obstacles, if it could deal with all of that. And so if you think about that, if the swarm can be effectively networked, that is going to be, where the competitive advantage lies.
We talked a little bit earlier about this in terms of the warfighter and autonomy. And is there anything you can add to that in terms of, when we're on the battlefield and maybe preserve of human capital in that sense, saving lives?
Yeah, I mean, so the goal, when we talk about autonomy and vehicle intelligence, the goal isn't necessarily that you are fundamentally, removing the humans from the process or removing the operators. It just takes on a different context, right? And so where can you reinvest human capital, or where can you reliably depend on autonomous capabilities? Fundamentally, I think you need to explore a lot of different options. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from where technology is developing in the private sector. Fundamentally, I think affordable mass plus Silicon Valley software, that combination is where competitive advantage truly lies. And so many of, as we all understand, the swarms are here, by the way. I mean, we've seen them, right? We've seen what happened in Russia with, the Iranians use a swarm, to open up their attack on, from within, from Iran. The swarms are here. And then fundamentally, it's just how do you really understand what the potential is and the possibilities are, not just from our own perspective, but from what everyone else is developing.
So just to kind of recap and maybe add a little bit further on what you just shared from, we have a lot of Pentagon officials in the room who are interested in this technology and this capability. What's your advice to them for leaning in, I guess, to the Silicon Valley grade innovation? Like, where do they start? How do they get?
Two things, I guess. So the first is start to ask, what if, right? Like, what if half the F-35s didn't have a pilot? What if all the F-16s didn't have a pilot? That obviously there's some F-16 pilots in the audience, I'm sure, who are not happy about that. But look, there's a lot of really hard problems that aren't, that were once considered like impossible in research that really aren't in that realm anymore. These problems can be solved. They are being solved. And so ask that question, what if? What if the swarms could emerge from anywhere? What if we could achieve, affordable mass with the best possible software and achieve, effective networking? The second thing is come see us. So I'm, similar to Secretary Driscoll and General George, come out and see what Silicon Valley is doing. And then, just like, I didn't know I needed a smartphone until I owned one. Mm-hmm. Once you actually see the technology, that's going to create a conversation. And then, as part of that, though, to be, completely honest, the way that this changes is top down, right? The way that we've seen actual traction is when you have the highest levels of the organization and you have those high-ranking champions who are really pushing for it. And so you see that in Admiral Paparo, you see that in the Army, and there's many examples of champions within, high level in all the services. So it's really about ensuring that they are ready to actually invest and do the kind of, things to reorient the organization, reorient the budgets, and really focus on where the competitive advantage is actually going to come from. I promise you, all of our adversaries are doing exactly that.
That's a great message and an interesting point for us to leave off on. Jason, thank you so much. And for those that are interested in learning more about applied intuition, they actually have a booth out in the hall, so come see us there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Editor-in-Chief of GovExec, Frank Conkle, who's actually going to dive a little bit deeper into the conversation about autonomous drones as well as predictive algorithms. Thank you so much.
Thanks.